Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your host, Curator Kevin Adkisson, and today I am coming to you live from the Collections Wing that is attached to Cranbrook Art Museum. And if you saw our announcement on Facebook earlier, the reason that I am here in the collections wing and decided to broadcast from the museum collection today is because on this upcoming Friday, February 26th, I will be delivering a lecture in collaboration with the Yale University Art Gallery on innovations in plywood furniture. And Yale asked me to help co-lead this talk, both because I used to work at the Yale University Art Gallery and because Cranbrook is a really central player to the history of plywood design, in particular because of two gentlemen, Charles Eames and Saarinen, who designed these two red chairs here at Cranbrook in 1940. So today's Live at 5 is going to review some of the innovations in plywood furniture and cabinetry that were developed here at Cranbrook in the 1940s. And then on Friday, I hope you'll all come out for our free talk at 12:30 p.m. And you can register for that. There's a link on our Facebook page, or you can go to the Yale University Art Gallery page and sign up for that talk. So today, we're going to be looking at some of the pieces that will be featured in greater detail on Friday. And I am grateful to my colleagues at the Art Museum and Corey Gross, the Art Museum's registrar, for working with me to allow us to be in here today after the museum has closed. If you've never been in the Art Museum's collection wings, hopefully tours will begin back up this year, and you'll be able to come and take one of the guided tours through our open storage facility that was designed by Smith Group JJR in 2011. So, when we think about plywood furniture, we probably think, hopefully, about the LCW, the living room chair W. And this is what we might call the potato chip chair, designed by Charles and Ray Eames. And you'll see that we have quite a few in the collection of Cranbrook Art Museum and Cranbrook Cultural Properties. And to get to this chair, which I'll talk about in a moment, we had to make some remarkable steps in the development of plywood furniture. So here in the collections wing, we can see some Gustav Stickley furniture, and you might be surprised to learn that Gustav Stickley actually used plywood as a secondary wood. So I'm not sure about this chair, but a lot of early American furniture, there is plywood. And on Friday in the Yale talk, we'll talk about pieces as old as 1750 that are made with plywood. But the revolution in mid-century modern design and the use of plywood in mid-century furniture really comes from innovations that were taking place in Finland in the 1920s. And this is a chair by the late, great Alvar Aalto. It went into production in 1930. It was developed in the 1920s by Alvar and Aino Aalto's furniture wing, Artek. And Alvar and Aino were both quite talented Finnish designers. And you'll see that the chair is mostly made up of solid wood, of Baltic birch, but then the seat is one piece of wood made of Baltic birch ply. Now, how in the world does a piece of wood make this shape? If we did not have plywood, you would just have to have a very big tree, and this would be a totally not structural work of furniture because wood is very much directional, and if you tried to make a wooden object that made this L shape, you would end up essentially breaking once the strength of the vertical was trying to extend out this way. It becomes very easy to break wood. It's how I broke my pepper grinder last night. But alas, this is not just wood, this is plywood. And so we see all of the layers of the different ply here. And this chair, if I get underneath it, you can see here all of those laminated boards. And this is one-directional plywood. And so I think that this is not cross-grained at all. And what I mean by that is that when the log is harvested, it's then dried in the lumber yard. They then take the wood and they reheat it. And so they heat it and they add moisture back in. And so if a tree has something like 30% moisture when you cut it down, they then dry the logs and then they re-steam them up to like 80 or 90% moisture content. So you have a very wet log. And they literally spin it around across a blade, and they just get these very thin veneers of wood. It was those thin sheets that were then stacked up with glue between them. And when the wood was still super wet, super malleable, they then layer it with glue, and they would literally stamp it into this shape. So they would have a big metal or wooden mold that would be in the shape of the seat back, and taking just paper or cardboard thin layers of wood, they would stamp it into this shape. Now, Eero Saarinen graduated from Yale in 1934. He then went to Finland and he saw Artek. He saw the company that was making this furniture. He was friends with the Altos, and he comes back. And that chair's 1930, this chair's 1938, and these are designed by Charles Eames and Eero Saarinen for the Kleinhans Music Hall in Buffalo. And if we look at the unupholstered version of this chair, so these were both made for Kleinhans, we're going to see some struggle with the plywood. So do you see this crack here? And generally, the wood is sort of a rough finish. And that's just a manufacturing difficulty that came from using such an innovative idea as to molding plywood into the shape of a seat. So when we compare sort of Alvar Aalto, he has this super thin, beautiful curve, no cracks. And then we see the American version, it's a much thicker seat, it's cracked. And so they end up having to upholster the chair as it's used in Buffalo still in the concert hall. In order to cover up those, what are essentially cosmetic errors, because the structure of the plywood is still quite strong. So these were designed here in the design studio of Cranbrook in the 1930s. They were made between 38 and 39 by the then new head of the design department, Charles Eames, and by Eero Saarinen, who was at that point essentially an assistant faculty member. And just like Eames, or just like Aalto, they have solid wood legs and arms within a plywood seat. The next revolution in plywood, and it's kind of amazing that we can tell this story with just objects from Cranbrook Art Museum. I think it shows the strength of our collection. This chair is a real revolution, and it's actually two versions of the same chair, so the larger armchair and then the side chair. And both are made of plywood, and both were made in prototype form here at Cranbrook. And this chair, you'll notice, is moving in multiple directions. So now we have compound curves. So instead of Aalto's chair, which is just straight back and flat, now the wood is moving not only in this direction, but also in this direction. So it has two directions to get this sort of spoon shape that is more comfortable for the body. And in order to have the wood do that, they really had to experiment. They had to use different pressure, different thinness of wood, different types of glue, different lengths of time pressing the chair. And ultimately, they were attempting to get these made because Eero Saarinen and Charles Eames had already at this point won first place in the Museum of Modern Art's organic design competition. And it was a competition that invited designers and architects to submit furniture for the future American home. But of course, 1940, a world war was raging, even if we weren't quite in it. There were already material rations, and so the idea was to use organic wood materials instead of what sort of had occupied designers for much of the 20s, 30s, and 40s of using plastics and glasses and different metals. And so Arrow and Charles won the competition by submitting drawings and little models that were made of copper by Harry Bertoia. And as part of winning, they then were paired with the Haskellite Company over in Grand Rapids to make a full-scale mock-up with the idea that it would go into production. But as we can see in the chair, this is not what they wanted. They actually wanted a fully plywood, wooden body chair, but they couldn't get the wood to bend in these complex curves without splintering. And so the upholstery is covering up this very rough construction. What they could do was essentially get 1 or 2 or 3 of the mahogany plywood to work, and those they used, and they upholstered the side that didn't work, the interior, and then when this was on display at the Museum of Modern Art, they turned this chair with its back towards the audience so that you would see that the chairs were made of laminated sheets of wood, of plywood, and it was simply the technology didn't quite line up for them to be able to create the chair they wanted. And of course, this brings us back to the potato chip chair, because in our timeline, we started with 1930, 38, 39, 1940, and in 1946, Charles, by this point, has married Ray Kaiser, who he met as a student here at Cranbrook. They've moved to Los Angeles, and they're now working alone in their Los Angeles studio, or together in their Los Angeles studio, but without Eero Saarinen. And on Friday, I'll show you pictures of their studio and what they called the Kazam machine that allowed them to really advance plywood into a fully sculptural form. But I've jumped slightly ahead of myself, so this is our end goal. But by this point, America is very much in the war effort, and they really don't have the resources to take a new consumer product like a chair to market. They need to be contributing to the war effort. And so Charles and Ray Eames end up designing plywood airplane parts, and most famously, plywood leg splints. And many hundreds of thousands of these Eames-designed leg splints would be sent overseas to both the European and Pacific theaters. And these were made in Los Angeles to Charles and Ray Eames's design. And what's kind of amazing about these leg splints is the way that they begin to use plywood and they begin to add and remove plies where the piece is affected by stress and by contouring. So if you see here, there's no layer right there in order to get this turn to happen. Or where they actually strap the legs on, they sometimes have additional layers of plywood added here so that this little piece doesn't snap off with the wood. So the version at Yale that we'll see on Friday actually has a much thicker little expansion there. So they're beginning to sort of think about, how do I mold plywood in multiple directions, but then how do I also remove plies in order to get these complex shapes? Now, after the success of their leg splint and all of the lessons they learned in building this leg splint, they then launched to the consumer through Herman Miller in 1948, the potato chip chair. The goal was to actually have a single unibody wood chair, much like their prototype at MoMA, where it's one piece of wood that forms the chair, but they actually never achieved that. Other designers did, but the Eameses sort of abandoned that idea in favor of making a 2-part chair with rubber gaskets to absorb the shock of sitting down, and to also allow greater comfort as the chair sort of moves with your body. So great sort of example of wartime production of the leg splint and of innovations in rubber gasketry being immediately converted into consumer goods after the war. And of course, you'll see that it also has a plywood leg and base. I called this a LCW for living room chair wood. There's also LCMs, which would be living room chair metal legs, or DCWs, which are a higher version of the chair, dining chair wood or dining chair metal. And if we look at this support, do you see how the ply is thickening here at this moment where the chair back is really taking a lot of stress? So they've actually added into the mahogany another ply here that then disappears and becomes thinner towards the top. It is kind of amazing. Now at Yale, there will be in our talk some of the prototypes here. And Cranbrook does have some very early versions, but what's cool about the Yale prototypes is they actually show the burn marks from where Charles and Ray overheated the plywood in their machine. And actually to hook up the machine, it needed so much electricity that Charles just took a rope and a wire and he tied himself to the local telephone pole, climbed up, hooked into the full voltage without the transformer in order to heat up and press the plywood chairs into existence. And all of that power ended up scarring some of those early chairs. We'll see that on Friday. Hopefully this has made you want to sign up for my talk. So I want to head up and talk about a few other objects in plywood, including this wonderful screen from 1948, or designed in 1948. Obviously, it's a sort of iteration, a development from the leg splint. So we again have curving layers of plywood. But what is so cool to me about this screen is that it compresses in on itself, so it's very small, easy to ship. This is the same time, 1948, that Ingvar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, is thinking about how can I make furniture ship cheaply. And so this is the exact same time the Eameses have designed a room divider that will ship quite small, but the actual hinges are made by laminating canvas into the plywood. So the canvas actually runs throughout the whole screen, and in between these layers, the canvas is running, and then the wood is only shown here. So the inside is actually slightly more complex geometry in order to have the canvas and the wood really linked together in the center of this screen. It's kind of wonderful, and then it creates such movement and interest across your room. And the Eameses were really interested in creating projects for the masses, and so they would make these pieces that would come in, this might be oak, but they would come in everything from rosewood to mahogany, really exotic hardwoods, all the way down to birch and oak and more affordable woods, because any wood can become a plywood. It just is how you harvest it. Now, over here, while I'm on the steps, I'll show you our row of chairs, and maybe you can see now that we're at level the difference between the living room chairs, the LCWs, and the dining chairs, the DCWs, how it's higher to reach the dining table, and then how also the back is at a higher angle than the living room is more reclining. The red aniline dye was another product that was offered as early as 1948, as were the black dyed chairs. My favorite, the one that I covet, is the one that's upholstered, and they simply add onto the top layer of plywood a pony skin or a cow upholstery, and so you have spotted chairs, again, as early as 1948, and these are still made, they're still manufactured, so you can still see them out in the world. Now, there's just a couple of other things that I wanted to point out while we're here in the collections wing. So if you have questions, be sure to type them in before we conclude so I can answer them live. I wanted to also point out two of the slightly later Eames objects from 1949 to 1950, the storage unit, which actually has solid wood cabinet fronts. You can see how they're dovetailed at the corner, but then plywood shelves. And so the plywoods are connecting into this series of aluminum structural struts. And so the aluminum, the plywood, the plastic, the fiberglass, and all of these modern materials are combined into a sort of endlessly reconfigurable storage system. And then, of course, the Eames lounger, which is attributed to Charles. This one is rosewood and leather, latex, rubber, and then aluminum and steel at the base. And again, the sort of use of plywood in segments to support the chair. And so instead of using his earlier interest in one piece of plywood being molded into the chair, he's using 4 different segments of plywood, 3 on the chair and then 1 on the ottoman. Now, there's also a couple of much later plywood pieces. I'm not actually sure what this chair is. It is new to me, being arrived here in the Art Museum recently. But then this little chair was made by Cranbrook's former architect in residence, Dan Hoffman, who last week we looked at Hoffman's Pickle Hut. These chairs were also made for Brookside. The prototypes were made here in the architecture department in around 1995. And then the production models were made in either Zeeland or Grand Rapids. And you'll see that Hoffman takes advantage of the same sort of property of plywood that you can add plies inside by actually attaching the rubber foot and bringing it into the plywood layer. And so as these pieces were cut and layered up, the foot would have been put in as part of the production process. Now, what's neat is when you are layering the plywood, you actually leave the edges rough. So it looks like a book before the book's been sliced. And so when these chairs would have been pressed, you would have had generally the correct shape going up. But then after it's done, you cut it down in order to get the smooth layered edge. Now, I think that's it for our plywood tour. But if you joined us for last week's Live at 5, you'll know that we looked at the Pickle Hut by Dan Hoffman. And I thought, since I'm over here at the Art Museum, I would show you some of the architectural models of the Pickle Hut by Dan Hoffman and the Cranbrook Architectural Studio. So this is a pretty cool presentation model. So this one would have been designed for display. For the client or for Cranbrook, who knows, the museum, but it shows us the Pickle Hut as it was built, including the bench and the concrete molding. And then there are also, in addition to the presentation model that reflects the building as built, there are 2 study models that would have been built to help the architect develop the plans. So these are as he's thinking about the Pickle Hut. And you'll see in the first version, it's actually a fully woven, fully round environment. And then the next version, it is beginning to become separated. And I love this version because you can see how the wall kind of circles in on itself. And I think that sort of shows the direct evolution to the final form, the teardrop form, where it's perfectly round on the back and then comes to this teardrop at the front. So there's always lots to see and talk about here in the collections wing, which houses the collection of Cranbrook Art Museum, but also Cranbrook Cultural Properties, which are managed by the Center for Collections and Research. So I'm the curator of some of these children, like the little Brookside chairs, and those Brookside models might also be my collection. It doesn't really matter when it comes to the sort of safety and security of these objects, which collection they're in. It is wonderful to have them here in a climate-controlled and humidity-controlled environment. That's really quite state-of-the-art. So hopefully, when this summer comes around, as people continue to become vaccinated and we all continue to wear our masks, Cranbrook will be able to reopen more of our spaces back to the public. And you are encouraged to keep your eye out on the Cranbrook Art Museum website to see if this room, the storage facility, the collections wing, vault tours restart. Thanks again for the access here, and thank you to the Art Museum for allowing me to talk about some of their beautiful works of plywood furniture today. Thank you all for watching, and I do encourage you to head over to The initial post about this lecture, or about this Live at 5, has a link to the Yale lecture, and that's again Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and I'll be presenting with my former Winterthur colleague Alexandra Ward, who is now a fellow at Yale, and so it's going to be even more plywood fun. Thanks so much for watching. I'll be back on Tuesday on Instagram for Live at 5, or I will be back here on Facebook next Wednesday for another Live at 5. Until next time, everyone, I hope that you go and you thank a piece of plywood for its beauty and innovation, and I will be heading home to sit in my own little version of the, I have a DCM in my apartment. Until next time, everyone.